Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most endlessly debated, wildly misunderstood, and genuinely fascinating chapters in the story of human civilization, the ancient Sumerian texts and their accounts of beings called the Anunnaki. Now, before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome. This is a space where we explore the deepest mysteries of the ancient world with curiosity, critical thinking, and a commitment to what the evidence actually tells us. So go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing this global community come together, whether you're in Tokyo at dawn, London in the afternoon, or Los Angeles late at night. Now let's set the mood. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan, get comfortable, grab a drink. We're going on a journey tonight, and it's going to take us back more than 4,000 years to the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, to clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped signs, to temple complexes rising from the flat plains, to stories of gods descending from the heavens and needing something from earth, something vital, something that would determine their very survival. You've probably heard the sensational version: ancient astronauts, genetic manipulation, gold mining operations run by extraterrestrials. It's everywhere: books, documentaries, internet forums. And I'll be honest with you, these stories are compelling. They tap into something deep in our imagination, this idea that we're not alone, that our origins are far stranger than we've been told. But here's the thing: the actual Sumerian texts, they tell a story that's different, more nuanced, and in many ways far more interesting than the alien narrative that's been overlaid on them. Tonight, we're going to peel back those layers of modern interpretation and get to what the ancient Mesopotamians actually wrote, what they actually believed, and why these stories mattered so profoundly to them. We'll trace the origins of the Anunnaki from the earliest cuneiform sources. We'll explore their relationship to Earth, to humanity, to the cosmic order that the Sumerians understood. We'll examine specific texts line by line in some cases, looking at what words actually mean in their original context. And yes, we'll spend considerable time addressing the modern myths, the mistranslations, the deliberate distortions that have turned ancient theology into pseudoscientific speculation. Because understanding what's wrong with the popular narrative is just as important as understanding what's right about the authentic sources. So buckle in. This is going to be detailed, it's going to be thorough, and by the end, you'll have a genuine understanding of what the Sumerian texts actually reveal. Let's begin. The story starts not with aliens or gold mines, but with water. In the beginning, according to the Sumerian creation accounts preserved in texts like the Eridu Genesis and echoed in the later Babylonian Enuma Elish, there was Namu, the primordial sea, the waters of creation from which everything emerged. This isn't metaphor in the way we might use metaphor today. For the ancient Mesopotamians, water was the fundamental substance of reality. They lived between two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, in a landscape where the annual flooding determined life or death, abundance or famine. Water was creative and destructive, life-giving and chaotic. So when their priests and scribes sat down to explain the origins of everything, they began with water. From Namu emerged En, the sky god, and Kai, the earth goddess. Their union produced Enlil, whose name literally means Lord Wind or Lord Air, the space between heaven and earth where human activity takes place. This cosmology is preserved in texts dating back to around 2600 BCE, though the oral traditions undoubtedly go back much further. We're talking about the early dynastic period of Sumerian civilization, when cities like Uruk, Lagesh, and Eridu were flourishing city-states, each with its own patron deity, its own temple complex, and its own scribal tradition recording hymns, myths, administrative documents, and legal codes on clay tablets. Now here's where the Anunnaki enter the picture. The word Anunnaki is Akkadian, borrowed from the Sumerian Anuna, which can be broken down etymologically, and refers to heaven or the sky god. And Unna or Una is more debated, but most scholars translate it as something like princely offspring or those of royal blood. So the Anunnaki are the children of En, the great gods, the high deities who stand in contrast to the Igigi, who in some texts are described as lesser gods assigned to various labors. The earliest references to the Anunnaki appear in texts from the mid-3rd millennium BCE. They're not described as coming from another planet. They're not described as arriving in spacecraft. They are the gods of the Sumerian pantheon, divine beings who existed before humanity and who created the cosmic and social order. In the cosmology recorded in texts like the Song of the Ho, which survives in copies from around 2000 BCE but records much older traditions, we learn that after the separation of heaven and earth, after Enlil split and Kai apart, the Anunnaki needed something. They needed workers. They needed someone to tend the fields, to dig the canals, to maintain the irrigation systems that made civilization possible in this harsh environment. Let's pause here and really understand the context. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was not a naturally abundant paradise. It required intensive labor. The rivers flooded unpredictably. The soil, while potentially fertile, needed constant irrigation, drainage, and management. Cities needed to be built and maintained. Temples needed to be constructed and supplied with offerings. This was backbreaking work, and in the mythology, initially this work was performed by the gods themselves, specifically by the Igigi. The text known as the Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete accounts we have of early Mesopotamian mythology, preserved in Old Babylonian versions from around 1700 BCE, but drawing on earlier Sumerian sources, tells this story in detail. For 40 years, and in Mesopotamian cosmic time, this is symbolic rather than literal. The Igigi gods dug canals, cleared rivers, and performed the agricultural labor necessary to sustain the divine household. They grew exhausted. They grew resentful, and finally they rebelled. The text describes this moment vividly. The Igigi gods gather at night. They burn their work tools. They march on Enlil's house. The great gods are terrified. Anu, the king of heaven, is called. An assembly is convened, and the gods have to solve a problem. Who will do the work? The work has to be done. That's not in question. The cosmic order, what the Mesopotamians called me, the divine principles that govern reality, requires this labor. But the gods won't do it anymore. The solution: create humans. This is where humanity enters the Mesopotamian cosmic drama, and it's crucial to understand our role as the ancient texts describe it. We are not, in these accounts, genetically engineered slaves created by aliens who needed gold to repair their planet's atmosphere. That entire narrative, by the way, was invented wholesale by Zecharia Sitchin in the 1970s and has no basis whatsoever in any ancient text. We'll come back to Sitchin and systematically dismantle his claims shortly. But the actual Sumerian account is this. Humans are created by mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, specifically a god who was involved in the rebellion. Different texts name different gods for this role. The Atrahasis names Willa, a god who had rationality, or Temu in Akkadian. The goddess Nintu, also called Beletili or Mami, the birth goddess, forms the first humans from this mixture. This is theology, not biotechnology. The clay represents the physical, earthly component. The divine blood represents the spiritual component, the element that makes humans more than mere animals. In Mesopotamian thought, humans are hybrid beings, caught between the earthly and the divine, mortal but containing a spark of the immortal. And our purpose in this framework is to serve the gods by maintaining the earthly realm, by performing the agricultural and ritual labor that sustains the cosmic order. Now, let's get very specific about what serving the gods meant in practice, because this is where modern misunderstandings really proliferate. The Sumerian word for human being is Lu, which simply means person. But humans are also called Awalam in Akkadian, which can mean servant or worker. The primary obligation of humanity, according to numerous Sumerian and Akkadian texts, is to provide sustenance for the gods through agricultural production and ritual offerings. The temples were understood as literal houses where the gods dwelt. The statues of the gods in the inner sanctums were not merely symbolic, they were understood as the actual presence of the deity. These statues were fed, clothed, bathed, and entertained in daily rituals performed by priests who acted as the gods' household servants. The elaborate ritual calendar of Mesopotamian cities revolved around ensuring the gods were properly cared for. The great temple complexes like the Ekkur of Enlil in Nippur, the Ina of Inanna in Uruk, or the Esagila of Marduk in Babylon were economic as well as religious centers. They owned vast tracts of agricultural land. They employed thousands of workers. The surplus grain, oil, and livestock produced were offered to the gods in elaborate ceremonies, then redistributed to the temple personnel and the populace. This is what it meant to serve the Anunnaki, not mining gold for extraterrestrial overlords, but maintaining the agricultural and ritual systems that were understood as the foundation of civilized life. But here's the question that naturally arises. Why did the Anunnaki need this? Why did divine beings require food and offerings? This is where we have to think like ancient Mesopotamians rather than modern materialists. The gods, in Sumerian and Akkadian thought, were real. They were powerful, but they were not omnipotent in the sense that later monotheistic traditions would understand divine power. They existed within a cosmic order, not above it. They had needs, desires, emotions, and vulnerabilities. The offerings given to them weren't symbolic gestures but actual sustenance that maintained their power and their engagement with the world. There's a text known as the Debate Between Cattle and Grain, preserved in Sumerian from the Old Babylonian period, that makes this explicit. It describes a time before the creation of humans when the Anunnaki themselves had to eat grass and drink water from ditches because there was no cultivated grain, no domesticated animals, no beer or bread, the staples of civilized life. And then Enlil created cattle and grain specifically to provide food for the gods, but it wasn't enough. The gods needed someone to cultivate the grain and tend the cattle, hence humanity. This brings us to a crucial concept: reciprocity. The relationship between humans and gods in Mesopotamian religion was transactional but also deeply interconnected. Humans needed the gods for protection, for the ordering of the cosmos, for fertility of fields and flocks, for victory in war, for justice. The gods needed humans for service, for offerings, for the maintenance of their temples and cults. This wasn't slavery in the sense we understand it. It was cosmic partnership, albeit one with a clear hierarchy. And when humans fulfilled their obligations properly, when they maintained order, truth, the proper functioning of things, both humans and gods prospered. Now we need to talk about Earth itself in this framework. Why Earth? Why did the Anunnaki need Earth specifically? The answer, according to the texts, is that Earth is where productivity happens. The Sumerian word for Earth, Kai, is paired with an heaven in a cosmological duality, and is the realm of ultimate authority, of celestial order, of the fixed stars and the divine assembly. Kai is the realm of fertility, production, growth, and labor. The separation of An and Kai by Enlil created the space where life, including human life, could flourish. There's a text called Enlil and Ninlil that describes Enlil's connection to the earth. Nippur, Enlil's cult city, was understood as the geographical and cosmic center of the world, the place where heaven and earth were connected, where the divine assembly convened. The Ekkur, Enlil's temple, was described as a cosmic mountain, a point of contact between realms. Control of earth, specifically control of the productive capacity of Earth's agriculture, was essential to the power and sustenance of the Anunnaki. In another text, The Descent of Inanna to the Underworld, we see that the cosmos has multiple realms: heaven, earth, and the underworld. The Anunnaki are sometimes associated specifically with the underworld in later texts, where they serve as judges of the dead. But in earlier Sumerian sources, they are more broadly the great gods who oversee earthly affairs. The reason they needed Earth was not for resources to mine and export elsewhere. That's a modern sci-fi trope imposed on ancient texts. But because Earth was the generative realm, the place where offerings could be produced, where civilization could be built, where the cosmic order could be maintained through human labor and ritual activity. Let's go deeper into specific texts to really ground this understanding. The Sumerian king list, a text that survives in multiple versions from the early 2nd millennium BCE, begins with the famous line, "When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." Eridu was considered the oldest city, the first place where civilization took root. It was the cult center of Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and crafts. The king list then traces dynasties through various cities, and here's what's fascinating. It describes kings ruling for impossibly long periods before the flood, tens of thousands of years in some cases, then much shorter, more realistic reigns afterward. This has led to all sorts of wild speculation. But when we look at the scholarly consensus and the cuneiform evidence, it's clear this is a theological statement, not a chronological record. The antediluvian kings are quasi-divine figures who existed in mythological time when the boundary between gods and humans was more fluid. The text is establishing the divine origin of kingship, the idea that political authority descends from the gods, specifically from the Anunnaki, and is mediated through human rulers who are chosen by the divine assembly. Another crucial text is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which exists in copies from the 1st millennium BCE but draws on older traditions. While this is technically Babylonian rather than Sumerian, it preserves the same basic theological framework. In this epic, Marduk, the god of Babylon, defeats Tiamat, the primordial ocean, and creates the world from her corpse. He then proposes creating humans explicitly to serve the gods so that the gods can be at ease. The Anunnaki acclaim Marduk as king and build his temple, Esagila, in Babylon. The whole narrative is about establishing cosmic order, about creating a stable universe where the gods can rule and be sustained without constant strife. Notice what's consistent across all these texts. The Anunnaki need Earth because Earth is where the sustaining work of civilization happens. They need humans because humans can perform that work. This isn't about gold, it's about grain. It's about beer, about livestock, about woven garments, about the complex agricultural economy of ancient Mesopotamia that produced the surplus necessary for urban life, for monumental architecture, for the arts and sciences that flourished in these early cities. Now, this brings us to one of the most important archaeological discoveries for understanding these texts, the actual tablets themselves, and where we found them. The vast corpus of Sumerian and Akkadian literature we have comes from multiple sources. Many tablets were excavated at Nippur by the University of Pennsylvania in expeditions starting in the 1890s. These tablets, tens of thousands of them, are now housed in collections at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, and elsewhere. Other major sources include excavations at Ur by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 30s, at Uruk by German expeditions, at Lagash by French archaeologists, and importantly, at Nineveh where Ashurbanipal's library preserved Babylonian and Assyrian copies of older Sumerian texts. The Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, a project based at Oxford University, has made thousands of these texts available online with translations and transliterations. Anyone can go and read them. This is crucial because it means the evidence is accessible. We're not relying on secret texts or suppressed knowledge. The tablets are in museums, the translations are available, and the scholarly work is out there for anyone willing to engage with it seriously. When scholars translate these texts, they're working with a language that was painstakingly deciphered over decades. Sumerian, a language isolate with no known relatives, was cracked by comparing bilingual inscriptions, by analyzing thousands of texts, by building up a grammar and vocabulary through systematic philological work. This wasn't guesswork. This was rigorous linguistic science. And when scholars translate a Sumerian word, they do so based on how that word is used across hundreds or thousands of contexts, based on comparison with Akkadian translation the ancients themselves provided, based on the internal logic of the grammar. So when someone comes along, and we're getting to Sitchin now, and claims that everyone has been translating these texts wrong, that claim needs to be backed up with serious linguistic evidence. And here's the thing, Sitchin never provided that evidence. Let's systematically dismantle his claims because they've caused so much confusion, and because addressing them directly is the best way to clarify what the texts actually say. Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet in 1976, launching a series of books claiming that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth 450,000 years ago to mine gold. According to Sitchin, they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by mixing their genes with those of Homo erectus to create workers for their mining operations. He claimed all of this was recorded in Sumerian texts and cylinder seals. The problems with this narrative are multiple and fundamental. First, Sitchin claimed to have translated Sumerian texts, but he had no academic training in Sumerian or Akkadian. He took classes but never completed any formal degree in ancient Near Eastern languages. Professional Assyriologists, scholars who actually specialize in these languages, have repeatedly pointed out that his translations are wildly inaccurate. Let's take specific examples. Sitchin claimed the word Anunnaki means those who from heaven to earth came. This is wrong. As we discussed earlier, it means something like princely offspring of an or those of the royal seed. The Sumerian grammar doesn't support Sitchin's translation. The word Anuna is a collective term formed from and plus unna, not a phrase describing motion from heaven to earth. Sitchin claimed the word Nephilim from the Hebrew Bible is the same as Anunnaki and means those who came down. The word Nephilim in Hebrew comes from a root meaning to fall, and in the context of Genesis 6 appears to refer to a group of giants or mighty men, but there is no linguistic connection whatsoever between the Hebrew Nephilim and the Sumerian Anunnaki. They come from completely different languages and linguistic families. Sitchin's equation of the two is based on nothing more than surface similarity and interpretive fancy. The planet Nibiru is another fabrication. Now, there is a Sumerian and Babylonian word Nebiru which appears in astronomical texts, but it doesn't mean a 12th planet. In Akkadian, Nebiru means crossing point or ferry. In astronomical contexts, it refers to crossing points of celestial bodies, particularly the point where the ecliptic is crossed. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk is given the title Nebiru, meaning he is the central crossing point, the god who establishes order. It's a title, not a planet. Sitchin took this word, reinterpreted it as a planet despite no textual support, gave it an orbit that brings it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years, again with no ancient textual basis, and built his entire narrative around it. Michael Heiser, a scholar with a PhD in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages, wrote extensively debunking Sitchin's work. Heiser went through Sitchin's translations line by line and demonstrated conclusively that Sitchin consistently mistranslated, ignored grammar, and imposed modern ideas on ancient texts. Other scholars like Ronald Wallenfels, an expert in cuneiform studies, and the late A.R. George, a leading Assyriologist at the University of London, have said the same. Sitchin's linguistic claims simply don't hold up. The claim about gold mining is particularly instructive. Sitchin claimed the Anunnaki came to Earth for gold to make a powder they could spread in their planet's atmosphere to save it from some catastrophe. There is no Sumerian or Akkadian text that says this. None. Gold was certainly valued in Mesopotamia. It was used for jewelry, religious objects, and offerings. But there's no myth about gods mining it for atmospheric purposes. The texts talk about agricultural labor, canal digging, and temple building, not gold mining operations in Africa. Sitchin also made extensive use of cylinder seal imagery, claiming that seals showed rocket ships, planetary maps, and genetic engineering. But cylinder seals, which are small stone cylinders carved with images and rolled across wet clay to create an impression, have been studied extensively by art historians and archaeologists. The imagery is symbolic and religious. What Sitchin interpreted as planets are typically stars or divine symbols. What he saw as rockets are stylized trees or divine emblems. The context of these seals, how they were used, what the accompanying inscriptions say, all of this makes clear they're not depicting space travel. Why am I spending so much time on Sitchin? Because his ideas have permeated popular culture to such an extent that many people genuinely believe they're based on ancient texts. They've been repeated in documentaries, on websites, in books by other authors who cite Sitchin as a source, and they've obscured the actual fascinating content of Sumerian mythology. When you strip away Sitchin's fabrications, you don't get a boring, conventional story. You get a rich, complex theology about the relationship between humans and the divine, about the origins of civilization, about the meaning and purpose of human labor and creativity. Now let's talk about what scholars actually agree on regarding these texts. The consensus understanding, built on more than a century of archaeological and philological work, is this. The Sumerian and Akkadian myths about the Anunnaki are theological texts that explain the origins of the world, the nature of the divine, the creation of humanity, and the foundations of social order. They are not historical records or scientific accounts, but they contain the deeply held beliefs of one of humanity's first civilizations about ultimate questions. The Anunnaki as a group represent divine authority and power. They are the great gods who created order out of chaos. In texts like Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, the Anunnaki serve as judges in the realm of the dead. In creation myths, they are the ones who decide humanity's fate. In ritual texts, they are invoked as witnesses and guarantors of treaties and oaths. They are not individual personalities in the way that Enki, Enlil, Inanna, or Udu are. Rather, they function as a collective, the divine council, the assembly of the gods. Different cities had different patron deities who were part of the Anunnaki. Uruk had Inanna, goddess of love and war. Ur had Nanna, the moon god. Lagash had Ningirsu, a warrior god. Eridu had Enki, god of wisdom and water. These gods had specific personalities, myths, and temples. The Anunnaki as a whole represented the totality of divine power operating in the cosmos. The question of why the Anunnaki needed Earth can now be answered with precision. Earth, in Mesopotamian cosmology, is the realm of productivity and civilization. It's where the ordered world is built and maintained. The gods needed this realm to be functional because their own sustenance and power depended on it. Humans were created to be partners in this process, to do the physical labor of maintaining civilization so that the gods could focus on their cosmic roles, maintaining the movement of the stars, bringing the floods at the right time, ensuring justice, fighting chaos. This is actually a remarkable theological concept when you think about it deeply. Humans are not accidental. We're not insignificant. We have a crucial role in the cosmic order. Our labor, our farming, building, creating, and worshiping, sustains the world. This gave Mesopotamian civilization a profound sense of purpose and meaning. Every act of plowing a field, every brick laid in a temple, every offering made was participating in the maintenance of cosmic order against chaos. There's a hymn to Enlil that captures this beautifully. It's preserved in multiple copies from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE. The hymn describes Enlil's power, how his word cannot be changed, how he assigns fates, how he maintains order. And it says explicitly that without Enlil, no cities would be built, no settlements founded, no animal pens constructed, no sheepfolds established, no king would raise his crown, no high priest would be born. This is the dependence of the earthly realm on divine power. But the reverse is also true. The gods need the earthly realm to function properly, which is why they created humans to maintain it. Let's explore the different roles the Anunnaki play in various texts to get a fuller picture. In the myth Enki and Ninmah, also called Enki and Nintu, we have a story about the creation of humanity that's slightly different from the Atrahasis version. In this text, the gods are complaining about their work. Enki, always the clever one, lies sleeping while his mother Namu comes to wake him, telling him to create servants for the gods. Enki asks Ninmah, the birth goddess, to help. They fashion humans from clay. Then, at a celebratory feast, Enki and Ninmah get drunk and start a creation contest where they each create imperfect or disabled humans and challenge the other to find roles for them in society. This text is remarkable for several reasons. First, it shows the gods as fallible, as capable of drunkenness and folly. Second, it incorporates a kind of etiological explanation for human disability and diversity. But most importantly for our purposes, it shows that the creation of humans is specifically to relieve divine labor. The text says that the birth goddess will impose the work of the gods on humans. This is explicit and repeated across multiple Mesopotamian creation accounts. In Enki and the World Order, another Sumerian composition, we see Enki traveling around the known world, assigning functions to various lands and peoples, establishing the Me, those divine principles that govern everything from kingship to metalworking. The Anunnaki in this text are presented as assigning and maintaining cosmic functions. They don't do everything themselves. They delegate, they organize, they ensure that each part of the system works properly. There's also political theology embedded in these myths. Kings in Mesopotamia claimed divine sanction. They were chosen by the gods, often specifically by Enlil or by the city's patron deity. Royal inscriptions repeatedly state that the king was called by name from the womb by such and such god, that the Anunnaki proclaimed his destiny, that he was given power to rule. This served an obvious political function. It legitimized royal authority by connecting it to the divine realm. But it also created obligations. A king who failed to maintain the temples, who didn't ensure justice, who lost wars or allowed chaos to spread, was seen as having lost divine favor. The gods could and did change dynasties according to these myths. This is recorded in the Sumerian king list where dynasties fall and kingship moves to a new city. The Anunnaki, by establishing the system of kingship, created both authority and accountability. Now let's talk about the concept of fate, or Namtar in Sumerian, Shimtu in Akkadian. The Anunnaki are frequently described as decreeing fates. What does this mean? In Mesopotamian thought, fate wasn't necessarily predetermined in the way we sometimes think of it. Rather, it was more like an assignment or allotment. When the Anunnaki decreed someone's fate, they were assigning a role, a place in the cosmic order. For humans collectively, the decreed fate was to serve the gods through labor and ritual. For individual kings, the fate might be long reign and victory. For a city, prosperity and power, or sometimes destruction if they offended the gods. This concept appears in the myth of Gilgamesh. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which survives in Akkadian versions but has Sumerian antecedents, the hero Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He's blessed by the gods but also bound by mortality. When his friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is confronted with the reality that he too will die, despite his semi-divine nature. He goes on a quest for immortality, eventually meeting Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who tells him that death is the fate decreed for humanity by the Anunnaki. There's a council of the gods that made this decision, and it cannot be changed. This brings us to the flood myth, which appears in multiple Mesopotamian versions including the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the Akkadian Atrahasis, and the flood section of the Gilgamesh epic. In these accounts, the gods, usually led by Enlil, decide to destroy humanity with a flood. The reason varies. Sometimes humanity is too noisy and disrupting the gods' rest. Sometimes they've multiplied too greatly. Sometimes no reason is given. But Enki, who has a special fondness for humanity since he was involved in their creation, warns a faithful man, Ziusudra in the Sumerian version or Atrahasis/Utnapishtim in Akkadian versions. This man builds a boat, survives the flood with his family and animals, and afterward the gods grant him immortality. The flood myth is significant for understanding the Anunnaki's relationship to Earth. The decision to destroy humanity shows their ultimate power, but the fact that one god rebels against the decision and saves a human shows that the gods aren't unified, that there's debate and disagreement in the divine council. Moreover, after the flood, the gods realize they made a mistake. Who will serve them now? Who will make offerings? In the Atrahasis, there's a poignant moment where the gods, starved of offerings, gather around the survivor's sacrifice like flies. They need humanity after all. This reciprocal dependence is the heart of the relationship. The Anunnaki need Earth not as a resource colony, but as a functioning realm where civilization can produce the surplus and perform the rituals that sustain divine power. Humanity needs the Anunnaki to maintain cosmic order, to prevent chaos, to give meaning and purpose to labor. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. The temple complexes of ancient Sumer were massive enterprises. The White Temple at Uruk, dating to around 3200 BCE, sat atop a ziggurat and dominated the city. The offerings brought there, barley, dates, beer, animals, represented enormous productive capacity. The temple employed not just priests but administrators, craftspeople, farmers, herders, and laborers. The tablets found at these sites, administrative documents recording offerings and distributions, show the scale of this system. This is what serving the gods looked like in practice. It was the foundation of the first urban economies. We also have ritual texts, hymns, and prayers that show how Mesopotamians actually worshiped the Anunnaki. There are elaborate descriptions of festivals, of processions where divine statues were carried through the streets, of ritual meals where the gods were fed. The New Year festival in Babylon, the Akitu, involved reciting the Enuma Elish and ritually reenacting Marduk's victory over chaos. The king played a central role, representing humanity before the gods. This wasn't superstitious nonsense to the people performing these rituals. It was the maintenance of reality itself. Let's also address the question of whether the Mesopotamians themselves understood these myths as literally true. This is a complicated question because the concept of literal versus metaphorical truth is somewhat anachronistic when applied to ancient cultures. But we can say this: educated scribes and priests certainly understood that myths operated on a different level than historical chronicles. They kept both kinds of records. They had date formulas referring to historical events, the year that King so-and-so defeated such and such enemy, and they had myths about cosmic events. The language and context of each is different. At the same time, the gods were understood as real and active. When a city was conquered, the conquerors would literally carry off the statue of the defeated city's god, taking the divine presence into captivity. When a temple was destroyed, it was understood as the god having withdrawn their protection. The boundary between mythology and history, between religious belief and empirical observation, was different than our modern categories. What we can say with confidence is that the myths about the Anunnaki creating humanity and establishing civilization were understood as true in the sense that they explained the deep structure of reality. They answered the question of why things are the way they are, why humans have to work, why we die, why we worship, why kings rule, why there's order rather than chaos. Now, to pull all of this together into a comprehensive understanding, the Sumerian texts reveal that the Anunnaki needed Earth because Earth is the realm where the divine order becomes manifest in material form. The gods need offerings, temples, worship, and service not because they're weak or dependent in a negative sense, but because this is how the cosmic system functions. The relationship is symbiotic. Humans provide labor and devotion. Gods provide order, protection, and meaning. This is actually a more sophisticated and interesting idea than the ancient astronaut narrative. It grapples with real questions. What is the purpose of human labor? Why do we build civilizations? What is our relationship to forces greater than ourselves? The Mesopotamians answered these questions by saying that our work matters cosmically, that we are participants in maintaining the universe against chaos, that civilization is a partnership between human effort and divine power. The texts also reveal a profound ambivalence. Humans are created to serve, yes, but we're also capable of wisdom, creativity, and even challenging the gods. Gilgamesh, in his quest for immortality, pushes against the boundaries of his fate. Inanna, in her descent to the underworld, risks everything for power. The stories aren't simple propaganda saying obey the gods and shut up. They explore the tensions and possibilities within the cosmic order. When we read these texts for what they actually say, without imposing modern alien mythology on them, we discover a civilization wrestling with the same questions we still ask. Why are we here? What is our purpose? How should we structure society? What happens when we die? The answers the Sumerians gave, that we're here to maintain civilization, that our purpose is to participate in cosmic order, that society should be structured around temples and palaces with divine sanction, that death is inevitable but a good name lasts forever. These answers might not satisfy us today, but they're worthy of respect and serious engagement. The actual story the Sumerian texts reveal is not about extraterrestrials and genetic engineering. It's about the birth of civilization, about how the first urban societies understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. It's about the relationship between labor and meaning, between human agency and divine authority. It's about how irrigation, agriculture, crafts, and ritual created surplus, specialization, and eventually literature and art. The Anunnaki needed Earth because Earth is where this all happened, where the mud of the riverbanks became the clay tablets that preserved their names 4,000 years later. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing. These texts, pressed into clay by scribes who are long dead, in a language that was forgotten for millennia, preserve a window into how our ancestors thought about the biggest questions. When we read them carefully, when we do the hard work of translation and contextualization, when we resist the temptation to make them say what we want them to say, they speak to us across the centuries with clarity and power. The Anunnaki didn't need Earth for gold. They needed Earth for grain, for beer, for festivals, for the ongoing work of civilization. They needed humanity not as slaves, but as partners in maintaining the order of the cosmos. And humanity, in turn, found meaning and purpose in that work, understanding themselves as essential participants in something far greater than individual lives. The phrasing does not lift upward. It settles repeatedly into place. After the silence that closes the prior inquiry, the earliest hymns do not move the divine figures away from the ground. They return them to it. In the clay tablets recovered from Eridu and Nippur, the Anunnaki are not introduced as distant presences or passing visitors. They are written as occupants, named in relation to foundations, thresholds, and soil. The language rests low, close to the surface of the world the scribes knew. In the hymns of Eridu, one of the oldest cult centers known, the divine assembly is described as having taken their seats within the Abzu precinct. The term does not suggest descent from above. It implies arrangement, placement, a settling into an existing space. The Abzu itself is not rendered as a sky or a void, but as a bounded region beneath and within the earth, associated with freshwater, clay, and the sustaining layers below the city. When the Anunnaki are named here, they are named as those who remain where life is drawn upward, not where it originates beyond reach. The hymns do not explain why this placement occurs. They treat it as a given condition. The Anunnaki are those of the foundation, a phrase that recurs with slight variation across tablets. Foundations in Sumerian usage are not metaphors. They are surveyed, measured, and ritually prepared elements of construction. To associate a group of beings with foundations is to anchor them to permanence. The hymns praise stability rather than arrival. They assume presence rather than movement. In Nippur, the textual emphasis shifts slightly but remains grounded. The city, positioned as a religious center rather than a political capital, preserves hymns that describe the Anunnaki as convening within the Eker, the mountain house of Enlil. Despite its name, the Eker is not a mountain in elevation. It is a built structure, raised incrementally through human labor, brick by brick. The hymns describe the Anunnaki entering its gates, standing upon its platforms, receiving offerings laid on floors that required maintenance. Their authority is expressed through location. They rule because they are installed. The verbs used in these texts are restrained. The Anunnaki do not descend into the temples. They remain, sit, and receive. In one hymn, their presence is linked to the regularity of rites. When offerings cease, the text implies disturbance, not abandonment. The gods do not withdraw to another realm. They are unsettled within the same space. The concern of the scribe is not divine distance but divine dissatisfaction rooted in place. These hymns are not narrative compositions in the later epic sense. They function as records of relationship between city, structure, and authority. Their repetition across centuries suggests that the phrasing mattered, that the association between divine figures and physical ground was preserved intentionally. The Anunnaki are not framed as creators who complete a task and depart. They are framed as occupants whose continued presence requires upkeep. In Eridu's hymnic tradition, the earth itself is not passive. The Abzu is described as sustaining the gods, providing clarity of judgment and continuity of order. This reverses an expected hierarchy. Rather than the gods sustaining the land sustains the gods' function. The phrasing does not argue this point. It assumes it. The Anunnaki need to be where the Abzu flows, where offerings are processed, where the boundary between water and clay is maintained. The scribes who copied these hymns were trained to preserve exact wording. Deviations are rare and noticeable. Across copies, the emphasis on emplacement remains stable. Even when divine authority is praised, it is praised in relation to a city's endurance, not its expansion. The Anunnaki are invoked to remain favorable to walls, canals, and storehouses. These are not abstract domains. They are features that deteriorate without attention. What is absent from these hymns is as instructive as what is included. There is no anticipation of departure. No closing formula imagines a time when the Anunnaki will leave the earth behind. The future is conceived as continued occupation, contingent upon proper maintenance of the spaces they inhabit. When disorder is mentioned, it is framed as neglect within the system, not removal from it. This grounded portrayal raises a subtle problem. If the Anunnaki are bound to place, then their authority is tied to the survival of that place. The hymns treat this condition as normal. They do not explain it, perhaps because explanation was unnecessary. To the scribes of Eridu and Nippur, the world was not divided between a human realm and a distant divine one. It was organized through shared dependence on the same structures, the same resources, the same ground. The calm certainty of these hymns does not resolve the question it introduces. It only narrows its frame. If the Anunnaki are consistently written as those who remain, who sit, who require a maintained ground beneath them, then what form did that requirement take in daily practice? And how was it recorded when belief moved from hymn into administration? If the divine presence required maintenance, then the traces of that requirement would not remain only in hymns. They would appear where maintenance was counted. They would surface in records meant to be checked, corrected, and archived. And this is where the tone of the evidence shifts. In the administrative tablets from the early dynastic period, the Anunnaki do not appear as distant authorities. They appear as entries. From the temple archives of Lagash, Umma, and Nippur come thousands of small clay tablets, impressed quickly, often carelessly, by scribes whose task was not devotion but accounting. These tablets list barley distributions, oil allotments, textile rations, and labor assignments. Among the recipients appear familiar categories: temple workers, porters, gardeners, brewers, orphan dependents. And interspersed among them, without emphasis or explanation, are divine households. The phrasing is consistent. A ration is issued for the house of a named deity, sometimes specifying attendance, sometimes listing quantities identical to those given to elite human administrators. The tablets do not describe offerings in the ritual sense. They record provisioning: barley measured in sela, oil in standardized jars, wool weighed and assigned. These are not symbolic numbers. They are calculated for consumption. In several tablets from the Ina precinct at Uruk, the household of Inanna receives allocations that match the needs of a functioning estate. The entries note deliveries on regular intervals, tied to agricultural cycles. There is no indication that these goods vanish into abstraction. They are stored, redistributed, consumed by personnel attached to the divine household. The god's presence is mediated through an institution that eats, works, and requires continuity. What is notable is not the scale of these distributions but their treatment. The scribes do not mark divine names with special signs. They do not separate them from other accounts. A tablet might begin with a heading naming the month and year, proceed through a list of barley recipients, include a divine household midway, and end with a tally and seal impression. The divine entry does not interrupt the logic of the document. It conforms to it. In some cases, the tablets specify labor assigned for the work of a god's estate. Plow teams are allocated to temple fields. Weaving workshops produce garments designated for divine use. Again, the language is administrative. The gods are not portrayed as performing the labor. They are the reason it is organized. Their need is treated as structural. This raises a quiet implication. The Anunnaki, when named collectively in administrative contexts, are associated with systems that depend on sustained human effort. Their households require fields to be irrigated, storage rooms to be sealed, workers to be fed. The tablets do not suggest voluntary generosity. They imply obligation. The economy is arranged to meet these needs as part of its normal function. Even absences are recorded. Some tablets note shortfalls, delayed deliveries, or adjusted rations due to poor harvests. In such cases, divine households are not exempt. Their allocations are reduced proportionally or deferred. There is no indication that divine need overrides material constraint. The system bends, but it does not suspend itself. This treatment reframes how authority is expressed. The Anunnaki are not above the economy. They are embedded within it. Their presence legitimizes the system, but their sustenance depends on its success. The scribes who recorded these details were not making theological statements. They were ensuring accountability. Their concern was balance. In later administrative texts, seals impressed alongside divine household entries often belong to human officials. These officials are responsible for delivery and verification. The god does not sign. The human does. This suggests a chain of custody that runs entirely through human hands, even when the recipient is divine. Authority flows downward into procedure. The tone of these tablets is instructive. There is no awe. There is no explanation. The divine names function as stable categories within a bureaucratic world. The Anunnaki, as a group, appear less frequently than individual deities, but when they do, the context is similar. Allocations tied to collective rights or shared estates. Their plurality is managed administratively. What these tablets suggest is not weakness, but dependence of a particular kind. The Anunnaki are treated as entities whose continued presence requires predictable support. The economy does not serve them sporadically. It sustains them continuously. Civilization, in this view, is not an invention offered upward. It is an inherited responsibility maintained daily. Yet these tablets are silent on origin. They do not say when this arrangement began, only that it exists. They record maintenance, not establishment. The scribes assume that the system they manage was already in place. Their task is preservation. If divine presence is so thoroughly integrated into the routines of labor and rationing, then disruptions to the land itself would not only affect humans, they would affect the gods' households as well. When the ground fails, when layers of occupation are interrupted, where does such a system register that break? and how is it marked in the earth? When the system of maintenance falters, it does not leave a notation in an account ledger alone. It leaves a trace in the ground. Beneath the cities whose tablets record uninterrupted allocation, archaeologists encounter interruptions of a different kind. Thin, stubborn layers where routine ceased and resumed only after something fundamental had shifted. At sites such as Shuruppak, Kish, and excavation has revealed distinct bands of clean alluvial silt separating earlier occupational layers from those above them. These bands are not mixed with domestic debris. They contain no ash lenses, no pottery shards, no tools left where they fell. They represent water laid down rapidly, evenly, without regard for walls or streets. The soil composition is consistent with river flooding on a scale that overwhelms normal canal systems. For the builders who came later, these layers were not events remembered directly. They were surfaces to build upon. What is striking is not merely the presence of flood deposits, but their placement within the cultural sequence. Below them lie early temple foundations, carefully prepared, their bricks aligned to ritual axes. Above them, reconstruction begins, often with slight shifts in orientation, material, or layout. The cities resume, but not exactly as before. Continuity is asserted through rebuilding, yet the earth insists on a pause. In Shuruppak, the flood layer is thick enough to suggest an extended inundation rather than a brief overflow. The occupation above it includes renewed administrative activity, but with changes in seal styles and record formats. The physical interruption corresponds with a textual one. Earlier naming conventions give way to adjusted titles. The divine order is not erased, but it is repositioned. At Kish, the flood deposit sits directly atop what appears to have been a sacred precinct. The earlier temple floor is sealed beneath sterile clay. The next phase of construction does not clear it away. It builds over it. The earlier space becomes inaccessible, preserved by burial rather than memory. This treatment implies respect, but also resignation. What lay beneath could not be restored directly. For archaeologists, these layers are markers of environmental disruption. For the people who rebuilt, they were boundaries. The ground itself had intervened. If divine households depended on cultivated fields, storage rooms, and human labor, then such an interruption would have consequences beyond architecture. The soil layer does not distinguish between human and divine estate. It covers both. The stratigraphy suggests a moment when established systems failed simultaneously. Canals silted, fields drowned, archives destroyed or rendered unusable. The administrative rhythm that sustained both city and cult would have broken. Yet the rebuilding above these layers does not indicate abandonment of the divine presence. Temples reappear. Offerings resume. The Anunnaki are not described as having left. Instead, their association with place is renewed on altered ground. What is absent from the archaeological record is any attempt to return physically to the buried level. The earlier foundations are not reopened. They are treated as complete in themselves, belonging to a prior phase of order. The builders accept the new surface as authoritative. Memory is carried forward not by excavation, but by replication. This approach aligns with how Sumerian builders understood the land. Foundation deposits placed beneath temples acknowledge earlier layers without disturbing them. Inscriptions buried at corners name kings and gods, not floods. The interruption is not narrated in brick. It is absorbed into the stratigraphy. In some cases, later texts refer to rains before the flood and after the flood, but these phrases do not describe the physical layer directly. They function as temporal markers, separating conditions of governance and obligation. The soil, however, remains mute. It simply divides. The flood layers complicate the notion of uninterrupted divine administration. If the Anunnaki required stable ground to receive offerings and exercise authority through their households, then periods of inundation represent moments when that stability was compromised. The archaeological record does not show alternative arrangements. It shows pause and restart. This pause raises a quiet question about dependence. If divine presence was tied to specific locations, what happens when those locations are rendered unusable? The rebuilding suggests adaptation rather than withdrawal. The gods remain associated with the city, even when the city's surface changes. Authority adjusts to new terrain. Yet the layers also suggest loss. Archives sealed beneath silt are not retrieved. Ritual spaces are not reopened. Something ends, even as continuity is claimed. The Anunnaki, if understood as embedded within the functioning of the land, would be affected by such endings. Their reigns, as recorded later, are segmented. The earth in these moments acts not as a passive stage but as an active agent. It interrupts without explanation. It enforces division. The builders respond by preserving memory through rebuilding, not recovery. Civilization continues by accepting what cannot be accessed again. If the ground itself can interrupt divine administration, and if authority must then be re-established through adjusted structures and renewed records, how did the scribes account for such breaks in language? And what traces of that adjustment remain in the words they chose to describe presence, absence, and survival? If interruptions in the earth required adjustment, then the adjustment would have needed to be expressed somewhere more flexible than brick. It would have been carried in language, where continuity could be maintained even as conditions shifted. In the temple liturgies copied and recopied across generations, the verbs chosen to describe divine presence carry a weight that nouns alone do not. Sumerian, as preserved in these liturgical texts, is precise about states of being. When scribes described where a god was, or how that god endured, they relied on a limited but carefully applied set of verbal constructions. The Anunnaki are not commonly paired with verbs of flight or transcendence. Instead, they are associated with verbs that describe staying, dwelling, being sustained, and being set in place. In hymns recited within temple contexts, the verb gar appears frequently in relation to divine figures. It conveys placement or installation, as one might set an object or establish a seat. When applied to the Anunnaki, it does not imply motion through space, but completion of arrangement. The god is not arriving. The god has been put where it must remain. The passive nuance of the verb suggests that this placement is part of an inherited order rather than an ongoing act. Another recurring verb, shub, carries the sense of settling down or remaining behind. In liturgical usage, it describes the gods resting within their shrines or within the city itself. The verb does not express temporary lodging. It implies endurance across time. The Anunnaki are written as those who stay through cycles, whose presence is continuous enough to be relied upon for regulation and judgment. Equally instructive are the verbs used when sustenance is implied. Offerings are not merely given. They are described with verbs that imply feeding and refreshing. The gods are made to be satisfied, kept in good condition, or maintained in brightness. These constructions place the divine figures within a relational economy. The language does not frame offerings as symbolic gestures alone. It treats them as actions with consequences for the state of the recipient. In several temple liturgies from Nippur, the condition of the gods is directly linked to the regularity of ritual performance. When rites are correctly executed, the verbs describing the god's state are stable and calm. When disruption is acknowledged, the verbs shift subtly, implying disturbance or dimming. The language allows for fluctuation. It does not presume invulnerability. Residence is another area where verb choice matters. The verb do three, often translated as to build, appears in forms that indicate inhabitation when paired with divine subjects. Temples are not only built for the gods, they are where the gods live. The language treats the structure as a necessary condition for presence. Without the built space, the verb loses its object. This linguistic pattern suggests that divine existence, as understood by the scribes, was not abstracted from environment. The Anunnaki are linguistically bound to locations and conditions. Their authority is expressed through verbs of stability rather than dominance. They do not conquer space. they occupy it. The grammar reinforces this impression. In many cases, divine subjects appear in constructions that emphasize ongoing state rather than completed action. Aspect matters more than tense. The gods are written as continuously dwelling, continuously being sustained. The language resists finality. There is no verb form that indicates a completed departure. Even when divine displeasure is described, the verbs remain grounded. The gods turn away their favor, not their presence. They withdraw attention, not location. This distinction suggests that absence was conceptualized as relational rather than spatial. The Anunnaki could be dissatisfied while still being present, requiring correction rather than replacement. The scribes who preserved these liturgies were trained within institutional settings. Their choice of verbs was not casual. It reflected a shared understanding of how divine authority functioned. Language served as a tool of maintenance, preserving a model of the world in which gods and humans were bound together through routine action. What emerges from this linguistic evidence is a subtle form of dependence. The gods are not described as self-sustaining in isolation. Their condition is responsive to human activity and environmental stability. The verbs allow for fragility without undermining authority. They imply that survival in some form is mutual. This does not reduce the divine figures to human status. It situates them within a system where endurance is achieved through balance. The Anunnaki remain powerful, but their power is exercised through structures that require care. Language becomes the medium through which this balance is acknowledged and preserved. If the verbs of Sumerian liturgy frame divine presence as something that must be maintained through placement, sustenance, and continued residence, then the authority of those who manage these actions becomes central. Who, in this system, was responsible for ensuring that the gods remained properly installed, properly sustained, and properly attended to? And how was that responsibility articulated in the titles of those who ruled on their behalf? If presence depended on correct placement and sustained attention, then someone had to be answerable for that condition. The verbs that describe divine residence do not act alone. They imply oversight. In the political record, that oversight does not appear as ownership of power, but as custody. The earliest sections of the Sumerian king list do not read like declarations of conquest. They read like registries. Kingship is described as something that is received, transferred, interrupted, and restored. The phrasing is careful. Kingship descends to a city, then later is taken to another. It does not originate with the ruler. It moves independently of him. In these early entries, rulers are not celebrated for innovation or expansion. They are named, measured, and replaced. Reign lengths are recorded with precision, sometimes extending beyond plausible human lifespans, sometimes contracting sharply after periods of disruption. The list is less concerned with personality than with continuity. Authority exists apart from the king, and the king serves as its temporary holder. Several early titles reinforce this relationship. Kings describe themselves not as creators of order but as shepherds, caretakers, or administrators. The terminology emphasizes responsibility rather than autonomy. The ruler's task is to maintain what has been handed down, not to redefine it. This framing aligns closely with the linguistic patterns used for divine residence. Both assume pre-existence. In the earliest dynastic inscriptions, kings often state that they rule by the command, or in accordance with the word of higher authority. That authority is not elaborated. It is treated as understood. The Anunnaki are rarely named directly in these formulae, yet their presence is implied through the structure of legitimacy. Kingship is valid only insofar as it aligns with an established order that is not human in origin. The king list itself reinforces this arrangement by treating kingship as a stable institution that survives floods, city collapses, and dynastic failure. Individual rulers disappear. Kingship remains. This distinction suggests that power was not seen as emanating from human agency. It was preserved through succession. Even when kings claim achievements, they often frame them as acts of restoration. Temples are rebuilt as they were before. Laws are set according to ancient decree. Canals are cleared following old lines. The language avoids novelty. Innovation would imply a break with inherited authority. Instead, legitimacy is secured through alignment with memory. In this context, the king functions as an intermediary. He ensures that offerings are made, that temples are maintained, that labor is organized. His role mirrors the administrative logic seen in ration tablets. He does not command the gods, he services their estates. His success is measured by stability rather than dominance. The king list also contains silences. It does not explain why kingship leaves one city and moves to another. It records the fact without interpretation. The cause is assumed to lie beyond human decision. This assumption preserves the idea of absent authority, present in effect, absent in visibility. Notably, after periods associated with flood or disruption, the titles of kings often become more explicit in their emphasis on duty. The ruler is described as chosen or approved, not self-appointed. Selection implies an external criterion. The king is evaluated against something already established. This political structure suggests that governance was understood as stewardship over a system larger than any individual. The Anunnaki, whether named or implied, occupy the apex of that system not as active rulers issuing daily commands, but as the reason the system exists at all. Their authority is embedded, not exercised overtly. The calm tone of the king list reinforces this impression. There is no anxiety about legitimacy, only record. The scribes who compiled it were not persuading an audience. They were preserving sequence. Their concern was that kingship continue to be recognized as something that could be misplaced, interrupted, and recovered. If kings governed on behalf of authority that was not always visible, then the spaces in which that authority was anchored become critical. Governance required more than titles and lists. It required places where stewardship could be enacted materially. Where, then, was this absent authority meant to reside, and how did builders translate that expectation into stone and brick? If authority required a place in which stewardship could be enacted, then that place had to be more than symbolic. It had to be fixed, legible, and durable enough to outlast individual rulers. In the cities of southern Mesopotamia, the built environment answers this requirement with a consistency that suggests intention rather than ornament. At Ur and Eridu, the earliest temple platforms do not appear as experimental forms. Their foundations are deliberate, squared, and repeatedly rebuilt on the same footprint. Each rebuilding respects the axis of the previous structure. Even when materials change, orientation remains stable. The ground plan is preserved as if it were a record in itself. Builders treat the location as non-negotiable. The ziggurat in its earliest phases is not a tower meant for ascent. It is a raised base that defines a point. The upper shrine is small relative to the platform beneath it. Most of the labor is invested not in height but in permanence. Mud brick is layered, sealed, and renewed. Drainage systems are embedded to protect the mass from erosion. These are not features of a structure intended to move or be replaced easily. At Eridu, successive temple levels form a vertical sequence of shrines built directly atop one another. The earliest levels are modest, but the commitment to rebuilding on the same spot persists for centuries. The builders do not shift the sanctuary outward as the city grows. They accumulate it upward. The ground beneath becomes saturated with meaning through repetition. This architectural choice implies a form of residency. The divine presence is assumed to occupy a specific coordinate within the city, one that cannot be relocated without consequence. When rebuilding occurs, it is framed as restoration. Foundation deposits placed beneath new floors often reference earlier dedications. The past is not cleared away, it is enclosed. The layout of these temple complexes reinforces this impression. Access routes are controlled. Courtyards lead inward toward restricted spaces. Storage rooms cluster nearby, suggesting that goods meant for divine use are kept close to the point of presence. The city organizes itself around this fixed center. Streets curve to accommodate it. Canals are aligned to serve it. In the ziggurat precinct sits within a broader sacred district that remains stable even as residential quarters shift. This stability suggests priority. The builders do not treat the temple as a flexible institution that adapts to urban change. The city adapts to the temple. Such an arrangement implies that the entity associated with the structure does not wander. The architectural record also shows concern for continuity during interruption. After flood events or periods of abandonment, rebuilding efforts often begin with the sanctuary. Temporary structures appear elsewhere, but the sacred platform is re-established first. This sequence suggests that restoring divine residency was treated as a prerequisite for broader recovery. The scale of labor required to maintain these platforms is significant. Mud brick decays quickly without attention. Regular resurfacing, repair, and reinforcement are necessary. This ongoing effort implies expectation. The builders act as if the presence housed there depends on the structure's integrity. Neglect would not merely be aesthetic failure, it would be functional. In administrative inscriptions associated with temple construction, kings describe their role as renewing foundations so that it may endure. The phrasing emphasizes longevity rather than display. The structure is meant to hold something steady. The Anunnaki are not named in every inscription, but the logic of fixed divine residency underlies the effort. What is absent from these architectural texts is any suggestion that the divine presence relocates independently. There are no instructions for moving shrines to new cities. When kings boast of founding new temples, they often present them as restorations of older sanctuaries whose locations were already known. Discovery is framed as recovery. This approach to urban planning suggests that divine authority was spatially constrained. The gods are powerful, but their presence is tied to specific ground. The city becomes a vessel that must be maintained to sustain that presence. Architecture functions as a form of care. If the Anunnaki were understood as beings whose authority required fixed residence, then the city itself becomes part of their condition of survival. The builders do not ask whether the gods can remain without these structures. They assume they cannot. Their labor answers an unspoken requirement. Yet these structures do more than anchor presence. They also define orientation. The alignment of platforms, the cardinal directions marked by stairways, the sightlines established between sanctuaries and horizon all suggest that placement mattered beyond convenience. The city is not only a container, it is a coordinate. If divine residency was fixed not only to ground, but also to orientation, then the question extends beyond architecture into how the builders understood the sky above those foundations, and what role measured heavens played in sustaining what could not wander from the earth below. If orientation mattered, then it would not end at walls and stairways. It would extend upward into the sky that those structures framed. The builders fixed their platforms to the horizon, but the scribes fixed their attention to what moved above it, not as a distant expanse, but as a system whose regularity could be relied upon from a specific place on the ground. The astronomical tablets grouped under the name MULAPIN do not read as attempts to chart the heavens in their entirety. They read as guides written for observers who remain in one location. The stars are listed not for their distance or composition, but for their rising and setting relative to the seasons. Each entry is anchored to the agricultural year, to tasks that must occur at certain times if the land is to remain productive. The language of these tablets assumes a stationary observer. The sky is described as it appears from the settled cities of the alluvial plain. Stars rise in the east, culminate, and set in the west, but these directions are meaningful only if the observer does not move. The system depends on repetition from the same ground, year after year. The star lists connect celestial events to obligations. When a constellation becomes visible at dawn, a season begins. When another disappears, a different task is implied. The purpose is not prediction for its own sake. It is coordination. The sky becomes a calendar that governs labor, offerings, and maintenance. Its value lies in reliability. In the MULAPIN texts, the heavens are divided into paths associated with named divine figures, yet these divisions function less as realms of power and more as organizing principles. The Anunnaki are not described as roaming among the stars. Instead, the stars mark intervals during which the gods' requirements on Earth must be met. The celestial order supports terrestrial continuity. What is striking is the absence of speculation. The tablets do not ask what lies beyond the visible stars. They do not record anomalies with curiosity. Irregularities are noted only insofar as they affect the schedule. Eclipses are recorded as disruptions, not mysteries. Their significance lies in the need for adjustment, not explanation. The scribes who compiled these lists were trained observers. Their work required long-term commitment to the same vantage point. A moving population could not have produced such records. The sky described in MULAPIN is a sky that returns, whose patterns can be memorized and verified against prior records. Knowledge is cumulative. This cumulative aspect aligns with how divine presence is treated elsewhere. The gods are sustained through regularity. The sky, measured and recorded, becomes part of that sustaining system. It does not elevate the divine away from the earth. It stabilizes the conditions under which divine order can persist on it. The tablets also reveal an interest in alignment rather than abstraction. Certain stars are associated with city temples and their cultic calendars. Observations are timed to ritual cycles. The heavens are not separate from the built environment. They confirm its timing. In some copies of MULAPIN, marginal notes indicate corrections based on observation. The scribes do not hesitate to adjust the record. This suggests that authority lies not in the tablet itself, but in its accuracy relative to the sky as seen from the ground. Truth is maintained through comparison, not revelation. The tone of these texts is administrative. They list, they correlate, they instruct. They assume that what is being measured will continue to behave as it has before. The sky is dependable, and its dependability supports everything below it. If divine authority requires stability, then the sky's regular motion becomes part of its foundation. There is no indication that the Anunnaki are identified with distant stars in a way that removes them from the earth. Instead, celestial paths bear their names as a means of ordering time. The gods remain associated with cycles that return to the same fields, the same temples, the same observers. This approach to astronomy reinforces a worldview centered on maintenance. Civilization is preserved by knowing when to act, when to prepare, when to restore. The sky is not explored, it is consulted. Its patterns are inherited knowledge, passed down and refined, not reinvented. If the heavens were measured primarily to regulate work and ritual on Earth, then numerical precision would become essential. Observation alone would not suffice. Counts, intervals, and proportions would be needed to preserve this alignment over generations. How, then, were numbers themselves shaped by the same need for continuity and balance rather than discovery? If the sky could be relied upon because its intervals returned predictably, then those intervals had to be translated into quantities that could be handled, checked, and preserved. Observation alone did not sustain order. It had to be converted into number. In the accounting tablets of early Mesopotamia, mathematics appears not as abstraction, but as a discipline of balance. The sexagesimal system that governs these records does not emerge in contexts of speculation. It appears where goods move, where labor is assigned, where rations are divided and redivided across time. The numbers are written with care, often corrected, sometimes recalculated. Their purpose is not demonstration of ingenuity, it is maintenance of proportion. In tablets recording barley distribution, quantities are broken down into units small enough to be meaningful to daily consumption. The base of 60 allows division without remainder across many fractions. This is not a theoretical convenience. It is practical. The system reduces waste, dispute, and imbalance. It ensures that what is due can be delivered exactly as recorded. These tablets often include running totals. A scribe lists allocations to workers, to temple estates, to dependents, and then records what remains. The remainder matters. It represents continuity. Surplus ensures future obligation can be met. Deficit signals disorder. The mathematics is oriented toward preserving equilibrium rather than producing growth. In texts associated with divine households, the same numerical logic applies. The gods receive measured amounts, not symbolic excess. Their sustenance is quantified. This treatment suggests that divine need was understood as consistent and knowable. The numbers do not fluctuate dramatically unless the underlying resources do. The gods are sustained through the same arithmetic that sustains the city. The precision of these tablets implies trust in inherited measures. Units such as the sela, the gore, and their subdivisions are not explained within the documents. They are assumed knowledge. The scribes inherit a system already stabilized. Their role is not to redefine it, but to apply it correctly. Errors are occasionally visible. A miswritten sign is corrected. A total is adjusted. These corrections are small, but their presence matters. They show that accuracy was monitored. Numbers were expected to correspond to reality. Mathematics served as a bridge between record and resource. In more complex administrative texts, mathematical tables are included to aid calculation. These tables are copied repeatedly, suggesting that they were standard tools rather than innovations. They preserve ratios used for land measurement, labor conversion, and time reckoning. The repetition across archives implies consensus. The sexagesimal system also appears in contexts tied to ritual timing. Offerings are scheduled according to counted days and months. The same numerical framework that governs rations governs calendars. Mathematics integrates the divine and the administrative into a single system of expectation. What is absent from these mathematical records is any emphasis on originality. There are no claims of discovery. The scribes do not name themselves as inventors of methods. The tables are anonymous. Their authority derives from continuity. A method is valid because it has been used before and will be used again. This orientation aligns with the broader pattern seen across Sumerian records. Civilization is treated as something maintained through careful repetition. Mathematics is not a tool for expansion into the unknown. It is a means of ensuring that obligations already established can continue to be met without disruption. The Anunnaki, when they appear within this numerical world, are subject to its constraints. Their households are counted. Their requirements are balanced against available resources. This does not diminish their authority. It situates it within a system where survival depends on measured exchange. The sexagesimal system's endurance suggests that it was effective at what it was designed to do. It persisted because it worked within the limits of land, labor, and time. It allowed a city to remember how much it could sustain. If mathematics served primarily to preserve balance rather than generate novelty, then its role in governance was quiet but central. It ensured fairness, predictability, and continuity. It also imposed limits. Numbers reveal when something cannot be provided. When scarcity appears in these records, it is acknowledged numerically. Reduced rations are calculated, not excused. The system absorbs strain by adjusting distribution rather than abandoning it. Mathematics becomes a language for constraint. If divine authority was embedded within such a system of measured balance, then transgression would not only be moral, it would be numerical. How, then, did law articulate consequences when balance failed, and how were divine estates protected within that legal framework? When balance failed, it was not addressed only through recalculation. It required judgment. The same archives that record quantities and remainders also preserve rulings, penalties, and restitutions. In these texts, law appears not as an abstract moral system, but as a mechanism to defend continuity, especially where divine property was concerned. Early legal codes, preserved on clay tablets and fragments, consistently distinguish offenses against private individuals from offenses against temples. The difference is not rhetorical. Penalties involving divine estates are heavier, more exacting, and often framed in terms of disruption rather than harm. An offense against a temple is treated as an interference with a system that sustains more than one household. Temple regulations describe land, livestock, tools, and personnel as belonging to an estate that must remain intact across generations. The estate is not owned in the personal sense. It is administered. Kings and officials are named as caretakers, not possessors. This language implies that the estate precedes the office holder and will outlast them. Legal clauses governing temple land emphasize boundary preservation. Moving a marker, altering a measurement, or reallocating a field without authorization is recorded as a grave act. The text does not describe this as theft alone. It is framed as an undoing of an established order. The concern is less about loss and more about destabilization. In several codes, restitution for damage to a temple is set higher than for comparable damage to a private estate. The difference suggests that temples were treated as nodes within a larger network of provision. To diminish them was to reduce the city's capacity to sustain dependence, rituals, and seasonal obligations. Temple personnel are also protected under law. Priests, administrators, and laborers attached to divine households are listed with specific statuses. Their injury or displacement triggers formal response. The law treats them as extensions of the estate itself. Harm to them interrupts function. What emerges from these texts is a conception of the divine estate as an operational entity. It must receive offerings on schedule, distribute rations, maintain structures, and observe calendrical rites. Law intervenes when these processes are threatened. The divine is present not only in ritual but in procedure. Kings often introduce legal texts by invoking their role in restoring order. They describe themselves as appointed to secure justice and maintain temples. This appointment is not portrayed as creative authority. It is custodial. The king acts within an inherited framework, charged with keeping it from decay. Punishments for violations against temples sometimes include exile or forced labor rather than fines. These penalties remove the offender from the community or redirect their labor back into the system. The response is corrective, aiming to reabsorb or exclude the disruptive element. Notably, the legal texts rarely describe the gods as issuing these laws directly. Instead, the laws are presented as aligned with divine expectation. This suggests that legality itself was understood as part of the divine economy. To act unlawfully was to misalign with a pre-existing order. In some cases, temple regulations specify procedures for audit. Goods must be counted, seals checked, records reviewed. Discrepancies are investigated. Law supports accounting, and accounting reinforces law. Together, they preserve the estate's integrity. The Anunnaki appear indirectly in this legal landscape. Their temples are named. Their offerings are regulated. Their estates are defended through human courts. This implies that their survival, as understood by the scribes, depended on stable administration. Divine presence required material continuity. The emphasis on protection suggests vulnerability. The laws do not assume that divine estates are invulnerable. They acknowledge that mismanagement, encroachment, and neglect are possible. Law exists to prevent erosion over time. In this framework, justice is not primarily punitive. It is preservative. It seeks to ensure that what was established remains functional. Civilization, as reflected in these texts, is not an ascent but a holding pattern, maintained through vigilance. If temples were treated as existential centers whose disruption threatened the balance of the city, and if law functioned to shield them from erosion, then how were disputes resolved when divine estates came into conflict with one another, and who held authority when preservation itself demanded choice? The concern for preservation extended beyond material goods and structured labor. It reached into the body itself, where continuity could be interrupted by injury or illness. Medical incantation tablets, excavated from temple libraries across Nippur and Lagash, reveal a system in which the health of humans and the condition of the divine estate were intimately connected. Illness is described not solely as a physical phenomenon, but as a disturbance that resonates through the community and, by extension, the divine household. These texts frequently combine procedural remedies with ritualized speech. A physician scribe might prescribe a poultice or a fumigation, yet the instructions are inseparable from precise verbal formulas. The language of the incantation invokes both the human patient and the divine forces whose oversight ensures the proper function of the city. Healing is treated as restoration, not innovation. The objective is to return what has faltered to its expected state. A notable feature of these tablets is the mirroring of affliction. Certain ailments afflicting humans are described in terms that echo the vulnerabilities of the gods' household. A fever may be presented as the divine spirit's dissatisfaction, or a digestive disorder as a disruption in the supply chain of offerings. The correlation suggests that scribes conceptualized human health and the well-being of the divine estate as part of the same system of balance. If one faltered, the other risked disorder. Remedies are carefully codified. Ingredients are counted, measures are exact. Preparation is documented in repeated formulaic language. The precision mirrors administrative practice. Each treatment is designed to be replicable, to be handed down across generations without alteration. Continuity is valued over experimentation, ensuring that the human body, like temple stores, maintains predictable function. The texts also imply a shared vulnerability. Humans are capable of mismanagement or neglect, and the divine presence is sensitive to these failures. Illness is framed as an indication of imbalance between the patient and their household, between offerings and ritual observance, between the city and its caretakers. Healing, therefore, becomes a corrective measure that restores not only the individual, but the relational network in which they exist. Interestingly, medical incantations include instructions for observation, diagnosis, and verification. The practitioner is expected to monitor the patient over several days to confirm that the remedy has had the intended effect. This evidentiary approach emphasizes accountability. Knowledge is inherited and tested. It is preserved in writing to ensure that the same procedures yield the same results. Variability is minimized to protect the system. The integration of ritual and remedy also extends to the documentation of rare or unusual afflictions. In these cases, additional offerings or prayers are prescribed alongside practical treatment. The response is neither purely spiritual nor purely corporeal. The tablets suggest that healing functions at the intersection of material care and ceremonial acknowledgement. Human suffering is addressed in a framework designed to prevent further disruption of the divine-human equilibrium. The role of the physician scribe is therefore both technical and custodial. They administer treatments as a means of stabilizing the household, temple, and city. Their knowledge is specialized, meticulously recorded and transmitted within institutional structures. Each tablet is a record of what has been observed, what has been performed, and what must be preserved for the next practitioner. The emphasis on continuity is reinforced by repeated references to previous models. Many incantations open with phrases invoking ancestors or former practitioners who have successfully restored health. This practice situates the present treatment within a lineage of care, reinforcing the sense that healing, like administration and law, is inherited knowledge rather than discovery. Within this framework, divine affliction is never entirely absent. Tablets describe conditions in which a deity's displeasure manifests as illness among humans. The correlation is not elaborated as causal in a modern scientific sense. It is understood as a systemic reflection. Human vulnerability mirrors that of the estate, and treatment restores both levels simultaneously. Medicine, therefore, is inseparable from maintenance of the broader order. If health is approached as a shared vulnerability between humans and the divine, then sustaining life requires careful attention to both bodies and rituals, to both the measured application of remedies and the preservation of ceremonial obligations. Each procedure preserves continuity, ensuring that the networks upon which survival depends remain intact. If the human body can serve as an index of divine stability, then what mechanisms were employed to extend this vigilance beyond individual illness, to monitor and maintain the larger cycles of the household, the temple, and the city itself? If healing was treated as a form of continuity, preserving both human and divine bodies, then it follows that life itself was understood as a cycle requiring careful management. The Anunnaki, in the hymns dedicated to Enlil and Enki, are depicted less as distant arbiters and more as custodians of rhythms that sustain the land and its inhabitants. Their authority, according to these texts, is exercised through regulation, observation, and intervention, ensuring that the processes upon which civilization depends continue without interruption. The hymns present the deities as attentive to the timing of rains, the flow of rivers, and the fertility of fields. Enlil is invoked for the proper ordering of winds and clouds, while Enki is petitioned for the placement of canals and the distribution of waters to the soil. These actions are not framed as demonstrations of omnipotence, but as careful administration, the orchestration of known processes. Their concern is with predictability, with patterns that must repeat to maintain life on Earth. The language of these hymns is deliberate in its pairing of human labor and divine oversight. Farmers plow, sow, and harvest according to seasonal markers, yet the texts imply that these efforts succeed only because the gods uphold their cycles. Offerings and ritual observances are recorded as components of the system. In this framework, human activity is inseparable from divine management. Survival is a shared responsibility mediated by observation, record, and intervention. One striking aspect of the hymns is the specificity of the cycles described. The text identifies months, river stages, and celestial markers as coordinates for action. Agricultural planning is tied to divine attention. Flooding, planting, and harvesting occur within a sequence that is both temporal and spatial. This reflects a worldview in which the environment itself is a ledger, and the Anunnaki act as its accountants and regulators. The hymns also reveal concern for contingency. Should a flood fail or a drought arrive, ritual measures are prescribed to realign the cycles. These texts do not present such disruptions as cosmic accidents. They are treated as correctable deviations within a system. Priests and scribes are instructed to perform offerings, recite incantations, and conduct ceremonial labor to restore balance. The gods, though powerful, operate within a framework that requires attention and maintenance. In several passages, the hymns describe Enki distributing water to canals and ditches, ensuring that fields receive adequate irrigation. These actions are recorded as methodical, almost administrative, rather than capricious. The deity's role resembles that of a manager ensuring that each sector functions according to its schedule. Similarly, Enlil's regulation of winds and storms is described in terms that imply monitoring and intervention rather than spontaneous exertion of force. Human participants in these cycles are positioned as partners in the process. Temple offerings, labor assignments, and ritual observances all serve as instruments through which the divine system is maintained. The Anunnaki do not act alone. Their efficacy depends on adherence to prescribed patterns, on the continuation of knowledge, and on the proper execution of inherited practices. The texts treat these partnerships as essential rather than symbolic. The environmental orientation of these hymns emphasizes the interdependence of ecological and social systems. Soil fertility, water management, and crop production are inseparable from divine attention. The Anunnaki's regulation of these elements underscores a worldview in which authority is enacted through the preservation of cycles rather than through arbitrary dominion. Their power is procedural, embedded in the rhythm of recurrence, and contingent upon human cooperation. Even when the hymns invoke extraordinary phenomena, unexpected rains, sudden winds, or the arrival of locusts, the response is framed within the context of cycle management. Interventions are restorative. The concern is with re-establishing expected patterns so that both human and divine needs are met. The text positions the gods as stewards of order, with an interest in continuity over novelty. If the Anunnaki were regarded as managers of cycles, then their presence on Earth is inseparable from the maintenance of processes that sustain life. Their survival, as implied by these hymns, is tied to the effectiveness of these processes, just as human survival depends on the same rhythms. The texts suggest a system in which both divine and human well-being are codependent, each sustained through attentive observation and disciplined repetition. This understanding raises a quiet but persistent question. If authority is exercised through careful maintenance of cycles, and if survival hinges on such coordination, then what structures, ritual, administrative, and architectural, were deemed indispensable to ensure that these cycles could continue without interruption? And how did the Sumerians decide which practices could be abandoned and which must be preserved? The meticulous attention to cycles, to measurement and oversight, is not unique to Sumerian records, though the texts present it with remarkable clarity. Across the early Near East, inscriptions and administrative tablets from neighboring cultures display a similar orientation. Deities engaged in processes that ensure the continuation of life, rather than in acts of conquest or arbitrary power. In Ebla, Mari, and later Akkadian archives, one encounters gods whose functions revolve around the ordering of water, the distribution of grain, and the regulation of seasons, described in ways that echo Sumerian formulations without presuming direct transmission. These parallel inscriptions often employ formulaic language reminiscent of temple hymns, invoking the presence of the divine in the regulation of earthly affairs. Kings are recorded as stewards of resources, scribes as mediators between divine expectation and human execution. In Eblate tablets, for instance, offerings to the god Dagon are carefully enumerated and timed, and penalties for mismanagement are codified in administrative instructions. The concern is continuity rather than innovation, survival rather than display of sovereignty. The imagery present in early Akkadian inscriptions also reflects this managerial conception of divinity. Gods are depicted alongside canals, fields, and livestock, often with emphasis on provision and oversight. Texts describing the allocation of sacrificial animals or the maintenance of irrigation systems reinforce the impression that their authority was enacted through the stabilization of systems rather than through intervention in unpredictable or remote realms. Their presence is bound to specific locations and functions, just as Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as anchored to cities and estates. Even in cultures geographically distant from Mesopotamia, there appear faint resonances of this approach. In Anatolian inscriptions, for example, deities receive offerings in conjunction with seasonal cycles. While the texts differ in form and ritual context, they similarly articulate a divine role that is enmeshed in human-maintained processes. The emphasis on continuity, careful record-keeping, and procedural oversight is striking, suggesting a recurrent understanding of the divine as integrally tied to earthly systems. What is notable across these sources is the consistent framing of the divine as dependent, in a sense, on the maintenance of infrastructure and ritual. Gods are not portrayed as immune to disorder. They benefit from the human management of fields, storage facilities, and temples. This mirrors the Sumerian depiction, where the survival and well-being of the Anunnaki are intertwined with administration, accounting, and ritual observance. The recurring theme is that divine sustenance is inseparable from the material and organizational frameworks created and preserved by humans. In Mari, records of temple administration include lists of personnel, rations, and seasonal obligations that bear close resemblance to Sumerian ration tablets. Priests and officials are responsible for ensuring that offerings, irrigation, and harvests proceed according to schedule. The divine household is treated as a fragile but essential network, vulnerable to mismanagement, yet capable of endurance if procedures are meticulously followed. This illustrates a broader conception of survival as maintenance rather than as spontaneous replenishment. Comparative study also reveals differences that illuminate Sumerian specificity. Whereas some cultures emphasize ritual or symbolic intervention, Sumerian records repeatedly embed the divine within measurable, quantitative systems. The Mulapin star lists, ration tablets, and legal codes all converge to depict gods whose efficacy is realized through consistent interaction with the human-maintained environment. In contrast, other Near Eastern traditions occasionally present divine action as more episodic, less procedurally constrained. Such variations suggest that while the idea of earthbound stewardship was widespread, Sumerian texts uniquely stress continuity through recorded, repeatable measures. The parallels invite reflection on how early civilizations conceived of the relationship between human and divine, between order and survival. Across the region, deities are bound to time, labor, and place. Their authority relies upon observation and compliance rather than mere enactment of will. The Sumerians, through their tablets and hymns, present this interdependence with particular density and clarity. Their accounts suggest that the presence of the gods and their ability to endure is inseparable from the maintenance of systems that humans themselves uphold. Yet these echoes leave a subtle tension unresolved. If multiple cultures independently portray deities as enmeshed in material cycles and administrative oversight, what does this indicate about the fundamental human understanding of the divine, and how did the Sumerians come to articulate it with such precision in their texts? Can we trace the contours of this perception through surviving inscriptions alone, or is much of its rationale lost to the fragmentary nature of the record? The persistence of cycles and the care with which they were recorded point to a broader concern, the preservation of memory. In the scribal schools of Sumer, students copied and recopied texts on clay tablets, producing layers of repetition that ensured continuity even as individual artifacts deteriorated. Unlike monumental stone inscriptions, which were intended to impress the present observer, clay was malleable, reproducible, and integrated into daily administrative life. The choice of this material reflects an understanding of memory as living practice, something renewed with each hand that impressed its symbols. These tablets reveal a meticulous attention to detail. Students practice the writing of divine names alongside numerical notations, measurements, and instructions for ritual and irrigation. Each stroke was not merely a mark on clay, but a rehearsal of the procedures that preserved both human and divine well-being. The texts are formulaic, yet their repetition is intentional, forming a chain of custody for knowledge that can survive the loss of a single tablet or the fall of a city. Scribal colophons, the notations at the end of tablets, often record the teacher's name, the student's name, and the purpose of the exercise. These annotations suggest a conscious recognition of continuity. The record itself is a vehicle of inheritance. Knowledge is preserved not as an abstract idea, but as a chain of custody maintained through copying. In some exercises, students were instructed to reproduce older texts word for word, sometimes in archaic cuneiform forms, ensuring that the memory of early administrative, religious, or astronomical procedures remained legible to future generations. The content of these tablets is telling. Temple hymns, ration lists, legal codes, and astronomical observations coexist on the same medium, treated with equal care. The juxtaposition of divine, administrative, and practical knowledge indicates that memory was holistic. The survival of the divine estate depended as much on proper accounting and ritual as on theological correctness. Preservation was operational, a matter of sustaining functions and procedures as much as recording names or deeds. The impermanence of clay, susceptible to breakage, water, and fire, was mitigated by replication. Multiple copies of key texts were produced, stored in archives, and sometimes even deposited in temples alongside offerings. Unlike stone monuments which fix memory in a singular, unchangeable form, clay allows for renewal. Each impression is both a record and an enactment of continuity, a way to keep knowledge alive in practice. The act of writing becomes a ritual in itself, maintaining the order that the Anunnaki and human stewards sought to preserve. Excavations of scribal schools in Nippur and reveal tablets in various stages of instruction. Some were exercises in neat repetition, others contained errors corrected in the margins, and some were used as templates for copying. The layered nature of these archives suggests that the Sumerians recognized the fragility of individual objects but trusted in the process of reproduction. Memory was not entrusted to permanence but to participation. It is cumulative, collective, and procedural. Even the selection of content reflects the priorities of preservation. Texts that codify offerings, seasonal observances, or divine permissions are frequently replicated, whereas ephemeral correspondence or non-essential records are less so. This implies a hierarchy of memory. What mattered most was not the singularity of the inscription, but the endurance of the system it recorded. In this framework, divine survival is inseparable from human fidelity to record keeping, and human administration is inseparable from participation in cycles that the tablets formalize. The scribes themselves were aware of their role in sustaining memory. Instructional tablets often include admonitions to respect the text, to copy carefully, and to observe the proper form. Errors are treated seriously, not only as mistakes of technique, but as potential disruptions to the continuity of knowledge. In essence, each tablet functions both as artifact and as an exercise in procedural responsibility, teaching future generations the techniques by which the divine and civic order could be maintained. This attention to impermanence contrasts sharply with the monumental architecture of temples and ziggurats, which physically anchor deities in space. Clay tablets, by contrast, anchor deities in practice. The Anunnaki are present in these records through the ongoing activities they prescribe, not through immovable statuary. Their survival is reinforced through repetition, observation, and human participation, preserved in the very process of writing and copying. The choice of clay also enabled adaptability. Texts could be updated, corrected, or expanded as circumstances changed. The memory of cycles, laws, and offerings could evolve while maintaining continuity with earlier practices. This dynamic aspect of archival life suggests that the Sumerians conceived of preservation not as static fossilization, but as active maintenance, a living heritage requiring engagement. If memory, in the Sumerian conception, was preserved in clay rather than stone, in processes rather than monuments, then the question arises: which texts and practices were deemed too vital to risk losing? And how did scribes decide which memories must be continuously reproduced to ensure the survival of both divine and human systems? The continuity preserved in clay and in careful ritual observance does not extend indefinitely. In the later layers of Sumerian administration, as one moves from the early dynastic period into the old Akkadian era, the frequency of direct references to the Anunnaki diminishes. Temple ration lists continue to appear, legal codes remain meticulously structured, and astronomical observations endure, yet the explicit presence of the divine household, once so central to every tablet, begins to recede. This quieting is gradual, not abrupt, and it is marked less by absence than by subtle omission. The late and Nippur archives illustrate this pattern. Ration tablets still allocate provisions for priests, temple personnel, and the care of sacred precincts, but the divine names are sometimes generalized or reduced to formulaic placeholders. Hymns that once named specific deities in association with seasonal cycles are replaced with more abstract references to the great gods, or simply to the temple itself. Where early records meticulously track offerings to Enlil, Enki, and Inanna, later texts treat divine provision as a background assumption rather than a specific responsibility. The presence of the Anunnaki becomes inferred, encoded in ritual practice and administrative procedure rather than overtly declared. This diminution coincides with broader shifts in political and cultural structures. The rise of the Akkadian Empire centralized authority under a king who, while maintaining temples and priestly duties, increasingly mediated between humans and the divine in place of detailed clerical recording. Archival practices reflect this change. While early scribes may have treated the Anunnaki as actors with distinct material needs, later scribes focus more on human obligations and temporal administration. The divine household is still acknowledged, but its management is embedded within human systems rather than enumerated as an independent presence requiring direct sustenance. Even in temple correspondence, the change is noticeable. Letters between priests and governors from the late 3rd millennium BCE reveal concern with ritual correctness, offerings, and seasonal obligations, yet the tone is increasingly pragmatic. Requests for resources or clarification of procedures rarely invoke specific divine actors as recipients. Instead, they appeal to institutional continuity and standardized practice. The emphasis has shifted from feeding and attending the gods as autonomous beings to maintaining the framework through which divine favor is expected. The texts suggest that the Anunnaki are no longer treated as immediately dependent on human administration, but their endurance is still assumed through adherence to established cycles. Archaeological evidence supports this textual observation. In excavation layers corresponding to the late III and early Akkadian periods, temples continue to be maintained, but fewer inscriptions explicitly attribute construction or renovation to the Anunnaki. Foundation deposits, once inscribed with detailed dedications to individual gods, now more often record the patron king and temple officials, with deities acknowledged collectively or indirectly. This material quieting parallels the textual trend, indicating that the divine presence had become a structuring principle rather than a continually enumerated household. The phenomenon is not absolute. Certain ritual and literary texts preserve explicit Anunnaki references, particularly in ceremonial contexts or in compilations of older hymns and myths. These instances function as repositories of earlier memory, retaining the names and functions of the gods even as everyday administrative attention diminishes. The contrast between preserved mythological memory and diminished practical reference underscores a shift in how the divine was integrated into human affairs, from active, tracked presence to assumed framework. Such silences raise questions about the mechanisms by which knowledge and authority are transmitted. The Anunnaki, once tangible figures in ration lists and legal codes, gradually recede into generalized reference. Yet the systems they oversaw, irrigation, offerings, temple hierarchy, calendrical cycles, persist. The continuity of function outlives the explicit mention of actors, suggesting that survival may not require perpetual acknowledgement of names, but relies on the procedures, structures, and practices they once required. Memory, in this sense, becomes operational rather than narrative, a quiet inheritance embedded in human responsibility. There is also an implication for understanding Sumerian conception of divine dependence. Earlier records portray the Anunnaki as participants in human-administered cycles, their survival contingent on the meticulous observance of orders and accounts. Later quieting does not remove this framework but shifts it. The divine becomes more abstract, integrated into institutional memory rather than daily enumeration. This suggests a layered approach to preservation, where certain aspects of the divine estate are maintained through ongoing practice, even when explicit reference fades. The endurance of the Anunnaki may have been less about continual mention than about the persistence of structures and procedures that supported them. The gradual disappearance invites reflection on the relationship between human record-keeping and the perceived needs of the divine. If the Anunnaki are no longer named with the same frequency, yet the cycles and administrative frameworks endure, does this indicate that their survival was considered assured once the systems were established? Or does it suggest a transition in understanding, that the gods' needs were increasingly mediated through human institutions rather than individually enumerated? The answer remains uncertain, preserved only in the gaps and quiet spaces of the late Sumerian archives, prompting a question that carries forward into the examination of memory, endurance, and the final traces of those whose presence was once central to the ordering of Earth. The quieting of the Anunnaki in textual records does not coincide with an immediate disruption of urban life. Archaeological layers from the post-Sumerian period, particularly in cities such as Nippur, and Lagash, reveal continued occupation and organized administration, even as explicit references to divine actors become scarce. Temples remain functional, canals are maintained, and the cuneiform bureaucracy persists, yet the framework is now largely oriented toward human agents, kings, governors, and priestly officials, rather than the enumeration of divine households. The persistence of these routines suggests that the systems established under the watch of the Anunnaki were robust enough to endure, perhaps by design, as practices that could function even when the actors whose needs had structured them were no longer explicitly invoked. Excavations of domestic and administrative compounds from this period show continuity in material culture and civic organization. Ration distributions continue according to pre-existing schedules, storage facilities remain orderly, and legal practice follows the templates set in earlier eras. Clay tablets from these sites preserve accounts, contracts, and temple correspondence that echo the meticulous detail of previous centuries, yet the language often omits the divine as a direct participant. Scribes continue to record offerings and allocations, but the motivations appear increasingly tied to precedent, custom, and civic responsibility rather than to immediate divine oversight. The infrastructure of the sacred and the secular seems intertwined, yet human agency assumes the central role in sustaining it. This continuity does not imply that the divine was forgotten. Hymns and ritual texts remain in circulation, copied in scribal schools and stored in temple libraries, preserving memory of the Anunnaki even as daily administration abstracts from their presence. The tablets demonstrate that cultural memory operates independently from operational oversight. Knowledge of the gods, their domains, and their care remains accessible, yet it is no longer a prerequisite for the functioning of urban systems. Civilization appears capable of moving forward with inherited structure, even when the direct references that once justified or animated those structures have grown faint. Evidence from urban planning supports this observation. City layouts retain the orientation and hierarchy dictated by earlier periods, with ziggurats continuing to anchor civic and religious life, but their inscriptions and dedicatory deposits show fewer individual divine names. The pattern of streets, granaries, and irrigation channels persists, suggesting that the practical demands of resource management had become codified into routines that could be maintained by human administrators alone. In this sense, the Anunnaki, once intimately tied to every ration and offering, are replaced in function by human memory, procedural fidelity, and institutional continuity. The phenomenon extends to legal and fiscal practices. Post-Sumerian archives indicate that temple estates are still managed with considerable precision. Legal tablets prescribe fines, labor obligations, and compensation for damage, but the language increasingly frames these regulations in terms of human accountability. Temples continue to receive offerings, but the emphasis shifts toward maintaining tradition and ensuring social order, rather than responding to the articulated needs of the divine. The system continues to operate, but the reasoning behind it, the presence of the Anunnaki as stakeholders in earthly administration, is less frequently articulated. Their functional role is preserved even as their narrative presence recedes. Medical and agricultural texts follow a similar pattern. Incantations and healing instructions survive, yet they are copied and performed as inherited practices rather than as direct responses to divine affliction. Seasonal management, water distribution, and crop planning continue according to established cycles, showing that practical knowledge could be transmitted independently of explicit divine direction. The continuity of these processes suggests that civilization, once established, carries within it the means to endure the attenuation of the actors that originally shaped it. Systems, rather than names, become the vector of survival. This raises questions about the mechanisms by which human societies internalize the needs of those whose oversight they inherit. Did the careful replication of ritual and administrative procedure serve as a safeguard, allowing human agents to assume responsibility in place of the Anunnaki? Were cities maintained as living repositories of procedural memory, their order preserved through repetition and training, even as the divine receded from immediate attention? The archaeological and textual record implies that the routines themselves, structured offerings, rationing, legal enforcement, and seasonal management, embody knowledge of the gods' expectations, carrying them forward beyond their explicit mention. Yet the record also invites reflection on fragility. While cities persisted, they did so within inherited frameworks that had once been justified by the presence of the Anunnaki. The endurance of these routines may have been contingent upon continued human diligence, education, and oversight. The absence of explicit divine guidance did not immediately collapse civilization, but it may have rendered it dependent on the fidelity of human memory and practice. The procedures once oriented towards supporting divine survival now serve as a template for human continuity, carrying forward an inheritance that no longer comes with explanation or immediate rationale. And so the question emerges quietly, yet insistently. If the structures and cycles that once sustained divine presence can persist without direct reference to their original beneficiaries, to what extent does civilization itself become a living memory, maintained through practice, rather than understanding, perpetuating patterns whose purpose has faded into custom? The answer remains embedded in the layers of post-Sumerian cities, awaiting closer observation and reflection in the chapters yet to unfold. Even as the post-Sumerian layers reveal continuity in administration and ritual, the tablets themselves harbor spaces of silence. Lines break mid-phrase, signs fade under erosion, and entire columns remain unfinished, as if the scribes recognized limits to what could be recorded or transmitted. These gaps are not mere accidents of preservation. They form a persistent pattern across sites and archives, hinting at knowledge that was either too complex, too sensitive, or too taken for granted to commit fully to clay. In the study of the Anunnaki, it is often these absences that speak as insistently as the words that survive, suggesting that the records themselves were conscious in their restraint, shaping understanding as much by what they omit as by what they enumerate. In many fragments from Nippur and Eridu, the language is elliptical. Verbs associated with divine sustenance and residence sometimes appear without clear subjects, leaving the reader to infer which deity, office, or household is meant. The tablets catalog offerings, labor, and administrative measures, yet in several instances, the rationale behind these allocations is left unexplained. The scribes assumed a context that modern interpreters must reconstruct from disparate sources, and in doing so, encounter an ambiguity that is itself a window into ancient cognition. The Anunnaki are often present as actors, yet the texts do not articulate why their continued presence was necessary in ways that can be fully resolved today. It is as though the requirement of their earthly residence was embedded in routine rather than argument, sustained through repetition rather than explicit reasoning. The practice of leaving certain elements implied rather than stated extends to calendrical and environmental records. Some of the MULAPIN star lists and seasonal observation tablets include notations that appear functional but lack accompanying explanation. Observations of celestial positions and river behaviors are recorded with precision, yet the connection to the divine agents that earlier texts emphasize is sometimes absent, leaving an open field for interpretation. Scholars have debated whether these omissions reflect lost ritual knowledge, a shift in priorities toward practical administration, or an intentional redaction of what was considered self-evident. The effect is the same. The tablets preserve sequences and procedures, but the underlying assumptions about necessity, dependency, or survival remain muted, a deliberate quietness that requires careful reading. Fragmentary legal texts convey a similar tension. Certain stipulations in temple law end abruptly, leaving the nature of the offense or the intended divine beneficiary partially unspecified. Even where compensation or penalty is described, the reasoning behind its magnitude or its connection to sacred expectation is left implicit. The scribal methodology, meticulous in enumeration, precise in quantities, yet sparing in causal exposition, suggests a culture of knowledge that relies on contextual familiarity. Administrators and temple personnel understood the obligations in ways that are opaque to us, and the broken lines in these archives preserve that opacity. In observing these lacunae, historians confront not just the limits of material survival, but the intentional architecture of what could be codified and what was left to living memory. Medical and ritual tablets reinforce this sense of deliberate incompleteness. Healing incantations often proceed from invocation to prescription, yet at several points, lines are missing, leaving remedies partially described. The correlation between affliction and the divine actor responsible is occasionally vague, and certain sequences of ritual action are left for the practitioner to reconstruct. This pattern intimates a form of knowledge transmission that is dependent on practice and oral instruction, embedded in the act of performance rather than in the permanent record. The Anunnaki, in these cases, exist in relation to human intermediaries whose own understanding fills the gaps, implying that survival and well-being were mediated by the interplay of recorded procedure and active engagement. Even in economic texts, omissions reveal a nuanced approach to administration. Certain ration lists and labor allocations leave the recipient or responsible overseer implicit, assuming familiarity with the households or offices involved. The scribes record the what and the how much with precision, but often not the why in explicit terms, as if the necessity of the divine presence and its maintenance were so embedded in procedure that it required no restatement. The broken lines and fragmentary sequences thus act as a silent commentary on the relational knowledge between human and divine. They suggest that the survival of the Anunnaki, and by extension the civilization that supported them, was mediated through systems that could operate independently of full explanation. The historiographical implication is that the Sumerian record was constructed with awareness of its own limits. By leaving certain lines unfinished, the scribes preserved space for interpretation, reflection, and practical engagement. The omissions are not failures of literacy or accident of preservation alone. They are part of a method of transmitting knowledge that treats memory, ritual competence, and procedural familiarity as essential components of understanding. The Anunnaki and their earthly needs are embedded in these lacunae, enduring in the shadow of what is unsaid as much as in the clarity of surviving words. As we examine the fragmentary tablets, the broken columns, and the fading signs, we are drawn back to the central question of why the Anunnaki required earthly presence. The records imply necessity without articulating it, outlining dependence through action rather than argument. If the texts were cautious in what they stated directly, how much more might have been understood through practice, observation, and shared memory, knowledge that was never committed to clay and is now lost to us. And in that deliberate silence, one cannot help but wonder, what aspects of survival, of maintenance, of coexistence were considered too essential or too self-evident to be written at all, leaving us to trace them only in the spaces between the signs? This is what the texts actually say. This is what the evidence actually shows. And honestly, when you really engage with it, when you read hymns to Enlil or the story of Inanna's descent or the wisdom literature like the instructions of Shurapak, when you visit museum collections and see the actual tablets, when you understand the sophisticated civilization that created these texts, the real story is far more fascinating than any modern myth we could project onto them. So that's the complete story, or at least as complete as we can make it in one sitting. The Sumerian texts reveal that the Anunnaki needed Earth because Earth is the realm of production, civilization, and meaningful labor. They needed humanity because we could perform the work that sustains cosmic order. And we, in turn, needed them for protection, justice, and meaning. It's a theological system that made sense of the world for thousands of years, that built great cities and produced magnificent literature. It deserves to be understood on its own terms, not distorted into alien mythology that strips away its real significance. I hope this journey has been valuable for you. I hope you'll go and explore some of these texts yourself. The resources are out there. The tablets are in museums. The translations are available online through projects like the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature. Read the actual words of the ancient scribes. See what they said. You'll find it's richer, stranger, and more rewarding than any second-hand interpretation. Thank you for joining me tonight in this exploration. If you found this valuable, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of this story fascinated you most? Did any of this change your understanding of ancient Mesopotamia? I love hearing from you, so drop a comment and let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, may your path through history's deepest mysteries be illuminated by curiosity, guided by critical thinking, and enriched by authentic wonder. See you in the next one.